Hello, everyone. It's an act of faith to say that, isn't it? But I do get the odd email convincing me that 2 or 3 people at least watch, and the kingdom grows one by one. My name's John Patrick, for those who've just happened to drop in. I'm a retired professor. Pediatrician biochemist is where I was named, but it's now 25 years since I left the university, and I've spent that time, in fact, it started while I was at the university, talking about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy, and how we need to get them on the same square if we're going to survive as a culture. So, all back today. I want to start with perhaps my favorite prayer. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit, that we may rightly love you and rightly serve you. I've changed the last line a little, but I find that prayer so humbling and supportive at the same time. It means it opens the Anglican Communion service in the older versions. Some people claiming to be wise but really fools who remove it. It's hard to improve on it. But you walk into church and hear that, and you say, right, I don't have to play any games at all. There's no pretense required because it's not possible. He knows everything. And he still loves us because he can see the future and we can't. It's a stunning thought. Everything's open. That's why you immediately need the gift of repentance so that you can honestly confess and be set free. A clean sheet. Try again. See if you can do a bit better this time. That structure at the back of your life is incredible. So many people are spending their lives trying to cover up the things that they should deal with by confession. And then, our Lord always moves us along in ways we don't always want to go. But he says, you need to learn to judge properly, starting with yourself. A non-judgmental society is a contradiction in terms because you can't want justice and then say we must be non-judgmental. At least to me, that seems illogical. Obviously, for many people, it doesn't, because logic doesn't matter to them either. Until they fall into the hands of a physician, then they want him to be competent. We are in real deep trouble. During the week, one of the things I did was to read through 1 Timothy. It's only 4 pages. I'm thinking of building a trip around to Jamaica in October, where I'm going for 20 days. And it's a lovely opportunity to meet people I knew years ago. Well, I go most years. I just enjoy it. And especially the times with students who, of course, are when they're in medical school and it's a bit overwhelming, somebody comes along and tells them, well, yeah, I know about that. Let me tell you something about it. It works. So 1 Timothy, of course, if only we could get minds round it properly, just one idea really, and could get it into the general population, it would change everything. Because the 3rd chapter is Paul writing to a young man who's running a church about leadership, amongst other things. And he tells him, you're going to need help, elders and deacons. And then he gives the criteria for this job. And it's not acquired at university. If you want the idea in a single sentence, it is the church must be ruled by people of Christian character. You can hire expertise. Got it? So we do the exact opposite, of course. If we need somebody to look after the money, we look for an accountant or a banker or somebody in finance. Well, They come second. First of all, you've got to find somebody who is utterly trustworthy and intelligent enough to follow what the experts tell them and say yay or nay, not on the basis of their expertise, but on the basis of what a church should do. So character is critical. And education is not producing character. To some extent it did in the past, at least by teaching young people what had happened in the past, who did what when and why and how it turned out. But now, of course, that's not happening. I often quote Eliot's prophecy from the 1930s, where he said, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" Now we have deans of medical schools who pride themselves on producing an information-rich environment without any real attempt to think about knowledge. Instead, they say, well, we teach evidence-based medicine. No, you don't. You teach authority-based medicine because the students can't read the literature. They're not capable. Nobody's capable of reading the whole thing. That's why we need cooperative approaches. But evidence-based medicine is authority-based medicine. You ask the students what they understand by it, and they say, well, we need to only take seriously articles from good journals written by people with a good track record. That's authority. It's not evidence. In order to be somebody who can read an article at the level that is required by at least some people, you must be able to read the methods section and understand it. If you can't, you're not going to be an authority in that area. And of course, that's not the way it works. And so Jay Bhattacharya, the new head of NIH, is certainly thinking about this and looking for ways to help with this, because it's apparent now that a large proportion of the scientific literature has never been verified by anybody other than the original authors, and many of them, when they are put to the test, fail, but that can take 10 years, and only if it's important. We have no idea how much of the literature is fabricated. We're building a house on quicksand. If we say we go where the science leads, well, look where the science, so-called, led us with COVID. At least intelligent people now know that we were badly misled, and hopefully in due course there'll be enough public investigations that you will actually see that that is true. If you want a little introduction to it, John Campbell introduced me to a wonderful clinician, a scientist who's published over 500 papers, and his name currently has slipped from my mind. It will return shortly after I finish this podcast. But John Campbell talking about COVID with a guy who's actually primarily an oncologist, and he saw that strange cancers were coming about, and he found out that if you had more than 2 injections of COVID, entered a group of people who, if they were vulnerable, could have very aggressive cancers. And I've come across a few people who died rather suddenly from their cancers during the COVID period. And of course, they were being pushed by people who thought they were doing good to say, well, you need more than 2. We've got to keep your immune system stimulated. Well, John Campbell's guest explains why that is not so. In fact, the exact opposite happens. That's an area where I think we're going to see a lot of progress. Things will come out, and the new head of looking at trials for the government was Kuldoff, who was one of the people who was cancelled for being correct over the proper management of COVID, along with Jay Bhattacharya and the lady from Oxford, whose name I've also forgotten at the moment. So that's just by way of setting up the idea of what can we do? Uh, what Paul goes on to say to Timothy is that he must make sure that those people who have character are also required to study, and he is required to study. He doesn't say everybody must read, because they couldn't read at that time, but you need the people who lead the church to be educating themselves by serious reading. And of course, reading has almost disappeared in the younger generation. Certainly, reading in the way that we used to read, they can't do it. And it's not their fault. It's that they've not been trained and that they were exposed to the attention span diminishing screens, which can give them a sense, oh yeah, I know about that. I heard so-and-so. And all that they know is a few scattered images. They couldn't write anything down that was coherent. And that process of coming apart, Eliot picked up in the 1930s. Other people picked it up later on. Then politics intervened into education and increased the number of people going to university and lowered the standards, inevitably. There's only a certain number of people in any area that really know what's going on. The leading researchers in the world, there's a whole mass of us below them. If we're fortunately, we have a few contacts with the people who are really good. And my goodness, they're in a different world. There's a need for more applied science, but it needs to be humble. But what we're doing at the moment is utterly disastrous. One of the reasons for this is that we have decided on identity politics, sex, gender, race, all those things. And we're even having quotas for them. That's going to be really difficult. There's really only one criteria for the university, and indeed for running anything. Get the best that you can. Competence and real skill. Gender, race, sex, they don't matter at all if you want things to work. It turns out that only a few people make the really important steps forward. And this week I came across a lovely, in the sense of very well constructed talk by a woman called Helen Andrews at a national conservative conference. Well worth listening. You can find it on YouTube. Helen Andrews National Conservative Conference. You'll find it. She's a writer, and she's talking about the changes that have occurred because of feminism. She says, I'm a woman, so I can say these things. And what she does is make you step back a little and think a bit more carefully about what's going on. She points out that, yes, male and female are very different. She starts off with something that I've been saying for years, actually, but I only said it jokingly by watching my children, my grandchildren over time, and having the kind of twisted mind that I have in some ways. I would say, well, the boys like games where there are fixed rules, and when you're out, you're out, and they laugh at you, and everybody takes a turn. And but it's just the rules are agreed to, and then you live by them. And there's no, there's very little sympathy and empathy going around when boys are playing their young games. The girls, on the other hand, are very much more relational. But they can be very nasty about it too, in more subtle ways. And Helen Andrews develops that idea along the way. She says the university as it existed before feminism, primarily, well, for a long while, was entirely male. I happen to have at least one boss during my training who was a blue stocking, one of the first women to become a doctor in England, from a noble family, the daughter of Lord Bicester, the Honourable Honor Smith. She was fun to work for too. But she was good. I mean, those early ones, they had so many barriers to get over. They were amazing. They had to be to push their way in. But now, of course, we have quotas. But skills don't know about that. Certain things are different. The most egregious example I can think of, which Helen Andrews doesn't mention, was a few years ago. The head honcho at Harvard was talking to the faculty, and he said, "We have difficulty in getting women into the higher levels of mathematics." All hell broke loose, and he lost his job because of that statement. What he should have said is, we have great difficulty in keeping anything like a balanced male-female ratio in the study of language. And everybody would have nodded and said, yeah, women are better at language than men. Then he could have gone on to, there's a little counterbalance. The same thing happens in mathematics, but with a reverse gender thing. Then they couldn't have really gone mad. The double standard would just have been so blatant that they would have had to bend the knee. But it didn't work that way. The head of Google got thrown out because he upset people's feelings. Nobody denied that what he said was true. Spatial mathematics is dominated by males because males' brains do that. Females write novels much more effectively because of their perception of human relations. That's just true. We have different functions. And we overlap in all of them. I mean, IQ, everything that's biological is in general normally distributed. So the male-female curves overlap. But what really matters is the tails, because it's a few people in the tail who make the difference. So it's not, I mean, it was difficult for women to go anywhere, but the main players in science, I don't mean very good ones who even reach the Nobel level, but the ones you can't do without, they're pretty well all male. In fact, I can't think of a female at that level. There have been good females all the way through, and the feminists don't even bother to know their own gender's performance earlier. I mean, Hildegard of Bingen, they sometimes know about, who was a truly amazing woman. There are others further back. So if we start to cut back on a gender basis, so you're going to cut back on the men, you might find yourself cutting back on exactly the people you don't want to get rid of. Whereas if you let competition run and be gender denying and say it's not an issue, you'll get the outcome that the university used to be like, which was a place where there was lots of vigorous discussion. And if you could prove the truth of your statement, other people would accept it. You weren't going to be challenged. You could say anything. We need to go back to that. But what Helen Andrews points out is that when the feminists came along, they had a real case to make. They were persecuted. They were denied justice. But as they gradually came in, they took over in various areas. She cites psychology as an example. 25, 30 years ago, psychology was almost entirely a male domain and rather abstruse and had little practical outcome, closer to philosophy than anything else. But now it's 80% plus female. But it's not doing what those guys did in the past. Now it's all about relationships, feelings. It's subjective. Empathy. Now, those are good things. Men need them. That's why they need women. It's not good for the man to be alone. The Bible says it doesn't say the woman can apparently cope perfectly well on her own, but the men don't do well. But we have lost any sense of balance in that area. And she points out how this has grown and grown. And so now we are experiencing, for the first time in the history of a university, a situation in which women and the human resources crowd, largely women, control the university. It remains to be seen for certain whether this is a good idea. I think we've already reached the stage where we can say, no, it's not a good idea. The fuss in Harvard over the black incompetent woman who was eventually forced to resign, but kept her job. Meanwhile, she had forced out of Harvard one of the best males they had in the sociology politics area. I think he's back now. Kulldorff, who was cancelled from Harvard, has not received an apology. This is the world we're in. So what she does in her talk is very graciously takes you through the whole process of what has happened and how it has happened, and suggests there's really all we need to do is get rid of affirmative action, because it's not a good idea. Tom Sowell had said this long ago, of course. He said the Ivy Leagues affirm kids from underprivileged groups so they can crow about how many they have, but they don't take any care for them. And they fail to a very large degree. Tom Sowell says they'd be much better off going to their local university where they'd be top of the class. I mean, when you affirm people because of something that isn't actually what the next 2 years is going to be about, which is intellectual ability, and you put them in an environment where they're bottom of the class because they haven't had the experiences that the kids from more, what should I say, privileged backgrounds had. I mean, for a long while, the Cambridge science faculty, especially physiology, chemistry, was dominated by 2 or 3 families. The Huxley family being one of them. Now, if you went to Christmas dinner with those families, you might have 3 or 4 Nobel Prize winners there. Think what that did to children who were there at Christmas dinner. They would listen to those people talking to one another and slipping from one language to another and obviously enjoying what they were doing. You think that made a difference to the way they approached learning themselves? Of course it did. The church helps. I mean, the church at its best can begin to move you in that direction. I would have been probably destroyed at Oxford or Cambridge. Fortunately, I didn't apply. I went to London, which was much more appropriate to me because I came from a blue-collar background. But my education in the church wouldn't happen today. I mean, because so few people went to university, there were plenty of blue-collar guys who actually had real interest in, when they became Christian, the scriptures, and particularly they became interested by different writers. So I can remember the little Brethren church I went to where no one had been to university, no one had significant secondary education. But I heard Josephus quoted there. I never heard him quoted again for years. And then only at conferences, not in church. That particular man really loved the Old Testament, and he could teach it in a good way. And my parents' idea of the best way to spend a Saturday afternoon in summer would be to go to a Bible conference, which all the Brethren churches put them on they rotated around. So every Saturday during summer you could find one somewhere. And there'd be some couple of talks in the afternoon, and then they'd provide tea and cakes and time to have some fellowship and get to talk to one another, and then a couple more talks in the evening. And a couple of times a year they'd have big conferences for the whole Brethren movement in Birmingham. There I heard people like F. F. Bruce when I was, a little boy. I was interested in reading very early on, and I can still remember some of those conferences um, because they were very high class. I mean, F. F. Bruce came from the same background, and his biography, in retrospect, is a good read if you're interested in these things. And Brethren Kids had a much higher success rate at university than almost any other denomination because we learned, we didn't have go away to Sunday school. We sat all the way through, and we learned to sit and listen, and we learned some skills which were very valuable, which I didn't recognize for years and years and years. I certainly knew the Bible extremely well because it was so much read. I mean, multiple passages of scripture could be read on a Sunday morning. So that's an incredible gift to have. My mother, who taught Sunday school, insisted that I learn chunks, not just verses. Yeah, and what a blessing that is, learning how to, the whole chapter, or say the first 18 verses of John's Gospel. In order to learn it, you've got to have some comprehension of what's being said, and you begin to see its structure, etc., etc. Mother loved poetry, although she had no education, and I had teachers at school who loved poetry. Now, hardly present. So, what should be happening, or put it another way, what used to happen is not happening, and the reasons are fairly straightforward at one level. One is certainly screens. I think that's now established, certainly to my satisfaction, that the longer you can keep your kids away from screens, the better they will do. Australia, I gather, has introduced a law saying that they should not be used until at least 16. The longer you can go without using screens, interactive screens, iPhone, the better. They shorten your attention span. They destroy your critical faculties. Not a good idea at all. You are much better being given books to read by people who know where you're at, what you can read now, and have in mind where they're going to get you to. Some books take a lot of preparation beforehand before it's worth making the attempt to read them. The medievals knew that because they certainly had no screens and they had very little paper, so they didn't have paper, they had parchment. So if you were being educated in the medieval university, there wouldn't be many people there, but they spoke several languages. And if you wanted to go on and be an academic, the key move was to be allowed to do a master's. And they didn't want to hear what you thought because you weren't old enough to have any thoughts that were worth caring about. What they wanted to know is, can you read a difficult text and understand it? And your master's thesis would be essentially a précis of a difficult text. And if you passed that, then you could go on. And those great medieval writers, they're still read today by people who are capable of reading them. I mean, you go right back to Augustine. The City of God was basically the account of how you should run a society. It was the book that framed the political growth of Europe. Man, not to have that background, you can't get to the same endpoint. And now we're losing that, so we're regressing. Whereas countries, areas of the world where sophisticated education came along later, I'm hopeful that they will do better. Obviously, at the moment, Africa has huge problems with corruption, and the thoughtful Africans will tell you that. But they are becoming more Christian while we are becoming less Christian. So they're heading in the right direction. We're heading in the wrong direction. What Tom Holland does in his book, which I dipped into years ago, and I should have done better than that. But Dominion is a brilliant book, which I'm only now beginning to understand why I should have paid attention to it before. But his is an intellectual journey from a little boy who loved the glamour and the warfare and the cruelty of Greek, Latin, Roman culture. But he became a historian. He writes fairly popular history, but he's very good at what he does. If you do get the book Dominion, read the preface. He can write beautifully. And what he did, I mean, before this book, he wrote one on Islam. So what he knows is how brutal the world was, how horrible it was. And his glamorized version, which just picked out the bits he liked, was not fair. And so in Dominion, he's taking you through basically the history of the Western world. And just the point I'm at the moment, which is about a quarter of the way through a 500-page book, he makes a comment about 3 centuries into the growth of Christendom, where still children were dumped in the drains, left on the scrap heap, whatever. If you didn't want a child, you threw it away. The only people who didn't do that, he said, inevitably were the Jews, and later Christians. In fact, one of the first things that Christians did that the Romans could not understand was pick up abandoned children. Because in many cities there was a place, if you didn't want a child, you dumped it there, and if somebody wanted to pick it up for usually nefarious purposes, they could. At the very least, the child would be taken and grown to be used as a slave. And the whole world accepted slavery. Paul wrote the death knell. The Jews didn't use them in the same way. They had slaves by choice, if you read Deuteronomy, and they were a domestic part of the family. The worst slave people were the Muslims by far. They had no problems with making slaves of anybody they conquered. And he sets this all out. But it was that little phase when he still talks about the groups that didn't do euthanasia, inevitably the Jews. The anti-Semitism that's going along today is entirely due, I think, to a failure to read any real history carefully. Sure, everybody, every culture makes mistakes. We're all fallen sinners, but the culture you live in does determine an awful lot. Sport requires rules, and at best it requires gentlemanly behavior. It's not an accident that sport flourished in somewhat rigorous societies when it comes to this. I mean, soccer, rugby, cricket, tennis, they all came from Europe. Why? Well, I leave you to think about that. I mean, all sport requires golf too, by the way. I'm somewhat I leave golf out because it doesn't interest me, but I mean, it's obviously worldwide huge. But they all came from Europe. And if you cheated when I was at school, you would get a reputation and punishment would appear in all sorts of ways. It wasn't worth it. Something you need to talk to your children about. The idea that winning is the only thing that matters is a destructive idea. So one other person, of course, popped up into my mind or on my screen this week, and that's Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton is one of my favourite writers, and that popped up was him talking to a younger man who was interviewing him, whose name I've forgotten. But Roger Scruton says, when talking about his own background, he said, well, 1968 was the turning point for me. And the other guy said, oh, yeah, you were in Paris. He said, yeah, I was watching the streets below when the students started rioting. And I saw them throwing stones at policemen and not pebbles. They wanted blood. And he said, I knew at that point that I didn't want that. Whatever I was going to believe, however I was going to live my life, it was not that. That's when the left wing died for him. Because I usually say to students, if you're not somewhat left of centre as a teenager, you're going to be a rather nasty fascist by the time you're 40. But if you're still holding on to utopian visions, you've been badly educated. You need to look at what's going on. That people could live in the world today and not recognized. We've tried the utopian dreams at least 25 times, the left-hand end, and every time it's ended in tyranny. You've got no good reason to think that it'll be any different next time. Scruton understood that. But he didn't know what to do. He said, it took me a long while. He said, because what I realized and what I needed to process is that we love our own place, our own countries, our own way of living. And we're not quite sure why, but we know that we do. And so I had to start writing philosophy and literature, starting from that point. What do we love and why do we love it? And that's a very wise piece of advice. He got thrown out of university for being anti the utopian dream. And actually he shrugged and he went underground in Europe and taught philosophy in Czechoslovakia largely, where he's considered almost to be a saint. But if you've never listened to Roger Scruton, you've got something very good. Just go Roger Scruton and pick up who he talks to and what he's got to say. And he's written some beautiful books. So he reminded me that, yeah, it's what we love. You know, I also didn't know that I loved the countryside where I grew up. I grew up on the edge of where the Industrial Revolution started. So if I went one direction, I ended up right in the heart of the Industrial Revolution. The stretch from Birmingham to Wolverhampton, it was said there wasn't a blade of grass to be found. That's all changed. But when I was young, that was it. The belching blast furnaces, the smoke, the flames, they were all there. The chemistry, the smells. But if I went the opposite direction, within about 10 minutes on my bike, I was on Icknield Street, which had been built by the Romans and hadn't been surfaced since the Romans. So riding a bike down it was like picking your way down a path. But it was so interesting. And I just had pleasure in the thought that the Romans had marched down this road. There was a Saxon church at one point with its 5'6" doorway, Anne Hathaway's cottage, Carlton Court, where Gunpowder Plot happened. And 25 miles from home, I got to Shakespeare's home in Stratford, where I would stop, turn around and come back. And 2.5 hours was wonderfully spent. And I loved that scenery. That bit of Warwickshire's very beautiful. I would go all over the continent on my bicycle, but always came back from the southern part of Britain and always came along a bit of Icknield Street just before I got home. And often thought, I've seen some wonderful stuff, but I love this area. And that love needs to be cultivated. Love of country is not wrong. It can be jingoism, and it shouldn't be that. But not to encourage patriotism, especially when it can be built on what is good. I mean, to teach physics, for instance, and have your students not know what these names have in common, all of whom play a role in physics. I'd start with Occam and go on to Buridan and Oresme, to Galileo, to Descartes, who also was a Christian. And then you come to Kepler, an amazing man. Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington. Every one of those names would call themselves Christian. That's not an accident. We love the world that God made, and if God gives you that kind of mind, he tells you you are to be a steward of it. And to be a steward, you must study. It took, well, I think nearly into the 13th century for that idea to take off. I mean, it goes back to the creation story in Genesis. But I think it wasn't until the 13th century when we'd learnt deductive logic from Aristotle, we realized it's better to go inductively because we know the Creator and we know that he's honest, reliable, and truthful. So experiment was born. Somewhere between 1277 and the mid-14th century in Oxford, Merton College, where it was certainly underway. That doesn't hinder teaching science. It brings it to life. When I'm speaking and teaching, I really only have one objective in mind. Can I be the channel whereby something that truly comes from God can enter somebody else's mind in a way that helps their life to be better than it would otherwise be? I hope I've managed to do a little bit of that. And the other thing that I learnt this week was from Tom Holland, was how Paul's "there's not male nor female, bond nor free," he didn't push that too hard because slavery was the norm everywhere until we had other sources of power. It was hard for people to see how they could do without slaves. And Aristotle said, well, some people are born to be slaves. But around the 300s, Gregory of Nyssa and his brother Basil, I think, and his sister, they began to show a respect for the image of God that led to the formation, the building of homes where the poor and the destitute and the lepers could be cared for. And they cared for them. And they started to teach the church. It led to asceticism, which I think went too far, but that's probably because I like my creature comforts. But Tom Holland's account of how they thought their way through this and what it did to Europe, the way people forced ascetic Christians to take public policy positions, to become bishops, as was the way it worked. Go read the book. You'll enjoy it. Read it slowly. Think about it. Make pencil marks in the margin, or if you're like me and you don't like margin written on, I put little dots, and then I go to the back page and put page wherever it is and what it was about that page that really intrigued me. The Lord bless you and keep you.